On the 3rd of November 1942, a British merchant seaman made his way into the execution chamber of Wandsworth Prison whilst the Second World War was still going on. He was someone who was condemned to death for treason, and he was only one of a few people executed during World War II for betraying the British realm. Duncan Scott-Ford was arrested back in Britain, and it was said about him that there may well be many who agree that death by hanging is almost too good for a sailor who will encompass the death of thousands of his shipmates without qualm. It was experienced executioner Albert Pierrepoint who brought the death of Duncan Scott-Ford to an end. But why was he executed, and why was his execution kept incredibly secret, and what did he do that brought his life to a swift end in London? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. On the 4th of September 1921 in Plymouth, on the south coast of England, Duncan Scott-Ford was born. When he was just a young boy, his father died, and he changed his name to try and improve his social status. He was educated at a rather prestigious school, but when he was 16 he enlisted to join the Royal Navy. He then joined HMS Impregnable in December 1937, but just before the Second World War broke out, Scott-Ford was on board HMS Gloucester, and the ship had docked at Dar es Salaam. Whilst here he met a German girl, and allegedly fell in love with her, and it's possible that during this visit that Duncan Scott-Ford may have begun to pass on top-secret information regarding the Navy to the enemy and people who should not have been given that information. It's considered that he may have told this woman secret naval codes, but then during the Second World War, in 1940, his ship was then stationed in Egypt. Whilst here he fell again in love with a woman, however she was a woman of the night, and Scott-Ford continued to visit her. It was discovered at this time that he had doctored his post office savings account book, and he was for this given a court-martial. He was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment, and with this was fired out of the Royal Navy. But when he arrived back in Britain, his sentence was reduced, and Scott-Ford did not know what to do, and he was forced to live back with his mother, but he then joined the Merchant Navy and travelled on board the SS Finland in May 1942, and he then arrived in Portugal. Whilst he was here, Duncan Scott-Ford met a man in a bar, and he was told that this mysterious man was called Riffman, and he could smuggle a letter to the girl Scott-Ford had met earlier in Dar es Salaam. He was then offered 1,000 escudos if he could give over information that British ships had been ordered to be in port on a certain date. Scott-Ford tried his best to find this out, and he continued to meet with the man, who would of course be a German spy. He gave over information about the state of the British morale and the extent of air raid damages, and he continued to meet with spies. He was then asked to find out information about British minefields, when US servicemen would arrive in Britain, and other intel regarding ships and aircraft. He was offered payment for all of this information, and Duncan Scott-Ford took a receipt of 1,000 escudos and signed it with his real name. He then went back to Liverpool, and he was interrogated to see if he had been approached by German agents, but Scott-Ford said he had been approached but refused to engage. His ship then sailed on the 26th of July 1942, again for Lisbon, and yet again he met up with German agents. He was threatened to be turned over to the British, but he gave over further information regarding an aircraft factory, training of soldiers who would later be involved in an invasion of Europe, and other pieces of intel to the Germans. But he was caught. He either had to find out more information, or he would then be turned over as a traitor by the Germans and would then be condemned. When he got back to Manchester on the 18th of August, Scott-Ford was asked about attempts by German agents to approach him. This time he spoke about a man who had asked him about communism in Britain, but the British had known that there was someone talking to the Germans, a man codenamed Rutherford, and that he had arranged a meeting with them. Scott-Ford said he had been given 1,600 escudos for information, and he was then taken into custody. To keep him under lock and key, an order was issued under Defence Regulation 18B for him to be imprisoned, and Scott-Ford was then taken to Camp 020, and he was interrogated here at Latchmere House. He complied with interrogators, but he slowly began to understand that he was becoming charged with being a traitor, and he understood the severity of what he had actually done. He became more agitated with this, and he may actually have been offered a deal. The British authorities were willing to spare his life if he had more pivotal information regarding how the Germans were conducting spying and intelligence in Europe, but Scott-Ford could give them nothing of use. It was later said in a report that, at the time of Scott-Ford's arrest, certain memoranda were found in his possession. This gave the position and names of ships and their escorts in the convoy in which he returned for the last time to this country, together with particulars of the speed, course and distance travelled, a log of the voyage and a description of the weather conditions and the aircraft protection provided. After his arrest, Scott-Ford volunteered a statement in admitting espionage on behalf of the enemy, and also that he had made the notes at the express request of these agents in order to hand them to the German espionage service on his return from Lisbon. On his return to England, Scott-Ford carried out the instructions of the German Secret Service agents by touring the public houses and mixing with fellow sailors and members of the services to take information from their possession. Because of this, he was charged under the Treachery Act of 1940, and it didn't take long before his guilt was established. But the only sentence that could be given to him under the Treachery Act was death. It was the first time that the judge in charge had administered a death sentence, and the judge later said, "I had always rather dreaded it, but when the actual moment came, I did it without the slightest trace of emotion." There were investigations to see whether Scott-Ford could be given a reprieve or some form of prison sentence instead, and the commandant of the site refused this, and he believed that there were many inside of Britain who believed that hanging was too good for Duncan Scott-Ford. Let's remember people inside of the UK had been suffering significantly from bombing raids, and someone who was their own betraying them and endangering their country, realm and people was very much someone who they believed did not deserve to live. Scott-Ford was held inside of the condemned person's cell inside of Wandsworth Prison, and he would not have too long to wait until his execution date came. Previously he had met with the British experienced executioner Albert Pierrepoint, who worked out the drop needed to bring Scott-Ford's life to an end. He worked out his height and weight, and with this decided that a drop of 8 feet 5 inches was enough to bring about a fracture or dislocation of the 4th and 5th cervical vertebrae, and bring about the instant death of Duncan Scott-Ford. Pierrepoint helped him into the execution chamber, helped by his assistant Harry Kirk, at 9 a.m. on the 3rd of November 1942. Everyone who passed by Wandsworth Prison that day had no idea what was happening, as the information about his conviction was kept quiet and secret from the public for morale reasons. Scott-Ford was helped over the trapdoor, and Pierrepoint placed a black cap over his head, and then secured the noose around his neck. Pierrepoint then shuffled the traitor over the trapdoor of the gallows, and released the trap, pushing a lever, sending Duncan Scott-Ford to his death. The following day after his execution, the public were informed through the newspapers that there had been a traitor condemned inside of Wandsworth, and they published incorrectly that he had betrayed Britain for a measly sum of £18. This wasn't entirely true, and his execution did act as a warning to other sailors who may be approached by the enemy. Duncan Scott-Ford was sent crashing through the trapdoor for his actions against Britain during World War II, and he is remembered, although less so, alongside men such as William Joyce Lord Haw for being executed for treason. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.